Hello, and welcome to the Employee Safety Podcast from Alert Media, where you'll hear advice from industry leaders on how to protect your people and business. I'm Peter Steinfeld. Today, we're joined by Melissa Newberg, Global Head of Intelligence at Cirrus. Melissa brings more than 15 years of intelligence experience, including roles at Meta and the U.S. Air Force. In this episode, we discuss why protective intelligence is the new standard for corporate security and which trends organizations should prioritize as threat intelligence dynamics evolve. Here's our conversation. Hey, Melissa, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me here, Peter.
Well, Global Head of Intelligence doesn't sound like a minor role. What do you spend most of your time on right now?
It is a busy time. I think anybody in this business is feeling that. It's a steady stream of events out there. We continue to say we've never seen it before. Every day there's something we've never seen before. So in my role at Cirrus now, we're in the risk intelligence business. And on paper, my role is really providing the sort of TLC for our content that's on platform, leading a team of researchers. But in practice, I just wind up doing a lot more engagements with clients, lots of different organizations from lots of different places, industries, sectors. So a lot of my time is actually spent sort of benchmarking and kind of understanding what's happening out there. How are organizations developing? How are they responding and, building, most importantly, I think, in that space too. So it's pretty fun to really get your hands dirty in the practitioner space with what's going on in lots of different companies right now.
Yeah, if you got to keep an idea of that bigger picture that's going on out there and things are changing so much faster and there's so much more volume of incidents that are occurring, that must make things pretty difficult for you.
Yes. And it's never a dull moment. It's very dynamic. I think that's one of the more fun things about my role is I like that dynamic environment. So being able to, one 30 minutes, I'm, talking with, a GSOC client or somebody in the watch floor space. And then another minute, I'm talking to somebody running a security team looking at facilities. And so it's never a dull moment in this day and age here.
Well, protective intelligence comes up quite frequently in conversations around executive protection. How do you define PI today and how do you see its role changing?
Yeah, so I spent almost 6 years at Meta helping to stand up their protective intelligence program before I came to Cirrus in October 2024. And I point out the date because before I left, I thought, there's very little chance I'm going to be talking about protective intelligence very often in my new role. And then, of course, December 2024 happened and the UHG shooting occurred. And basically since then, I haven't stopped talking about it. And I think it's becoming something a lot bigger than what it was, greater, of course, as a result of that. I do think that's probably partly a natural evolution because protective intelligence style of work spans beyond just an EP team. You see PI tactics across all kinds of areas of intel and security teams. Inherently, protective intelligence traditionally is focused on the executives, of course, but it's such a wide-ranging discipline where you're often a mile wide and an inch deep, and you touch so many parts of the business. You do a little bit of everything, when it comes to protective intelligence style security. So it's actually not surprising that it's beginning to take over, the space in a more significant way. And anecdotally, this time last year, I was talking with a lot of teams that, were either trying to mature some of their PI programs they already had or stand up brand new, wherever those responsibilities might lie. I actually had done a LinkedIn deep dive across job postings on LinkedIn and found no less than 100 PI-focused roles posted across 80 different organizations. I've never seen that many roles posted in the called protective intelligence before. Now I come across a lot more organizations that are really giving primacy to their PI teams in more significant ways, and they're taking on larger remits that cross disciplines. Insider risk can be very PI focused. The role is very similar. And I think that's partly a testament to the threat environment, but I also think that's a signal that how those teams are operating and the people they're hiring who are successful are really getting the job done, in impactful ways.
Yeah, historically, corporate security is really something that was much more reactive, but protective intelligence is more anticipatory. Do you see it spreading beyond just executive protection and organizations are thinking about how can we be more anticipatory across the entire environment, not just for our key executives?
For sure, yes. There's a spectrum of organizations they're all doing things in a different kind of way. Some are at a different kind of maturity level and are supporting, their CEO or the CFO or COO, by necessity. And then there are others that are really getting in there, having mature programs, supporting beyond just their C-suite level, really trying to target leaders or people in positions, maybe not, traditional sense of leaders, but people that are leading in their own right in a topical area that's potentially controversial or going to generate some interest from the public that's unwanted. And those teams are really the ones that are, getting more proactive out there. So you definitely see more proactivity. But on the other side of the spectrum, you have the teams that are still developing that by way of what happened in December 2024 and are now asked to do more with less, as we all know. That's the environment everybody's in now for the most part. And so how do they do sort of the bare minimum things to set up a program and do protective intelligence to some degree, maybe not to that maturity level where they're being proactive as well.
If you're trying to get your feet wet and get started in PI, is a good place to start with just a small group of executives to build out the model and see if you can sustain it at a larger level? Or do you recommend people just jump feet first into the water and try it for the entire corporation?
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword because typically in most organizations, your CEO is going to be the one that's sort of the most high profile. And so it makes sense to start there and build your support there, build your relationships there. But there's an access concern there because the CEO is potentially not going to give you as much access as maybe someone else, a different leader in the organization will. And so I think you can play both sides. There's the opportunity to find people in your organization that are potentially impacted by the threat environment. Someone working on controversial elections or has a title that, is potentially publicly on LinkedIn. And now people have found your title, even though you're probably not the person they think you are. They believe it nonetheless and have grievances against you. And so you might gain more traction, with that person who, maybe isn't as protected as a CEO and would be more welcoming to giving you more access and more information so that you can be more proactively supporting. So I think it kind of depends on where you can build the relationships and then get the access for information to be able to build that trust with those leaders.
So you should basically look at the risk profile of each individual or group within the organization or theme in the organization where there could be risk, rank it, and then essentially decide this is where I should focus my efforts.
Exactly. And I think that's what most teams that are in a mature place are starting to do is really developing out who those people are, trying to identify who those stakeholders are within that they can support and really develop relationships with. And then, work backwards from there. You can build out how do you assess someone's threat level. That's, a whole aspect of that you can work to develop threat matrices and things. And then build your, begin to build your program around some more of those people, I think often winds up pretty fruitful. Yes, support your C-suite, as you can, but those people often wind up needing a heightened level of support as well. And I think that's a great way to do it.
Well, speaking of building things, you've built and led protective intelligence programs inside large organizations before. So how has that practitioner experience that you've gained over the years shaped how you actually lead today?
I think it's really woven into the fabric of who I am, not to sound trite, but I think, that's how I want to show up in my role every day. I'm an analyst at heart forever, even if the role progresses. And I do think that a lot of analysts in like the intel and security business feel that way because they're really in it for the love of what they do. And I am definitely one of those people. Some of the most fun jobs I've ever had are the ones, I did early in my career, sitting on a watch floor or being really nitty gritty into the job and learning the role. And I definitely don't forget that experience today. I am biased, of course, but I do think that some of the best managers, directors, leaders, generally in this industry, in this space, are the ones who have done the jobs that they're asking their teams to do. Or alternatively, they've taken the time to sit side by side and really understand the jobs, live it to some degree. And that's not to micromanage because I think that's an easy thing to do and to lean into when you really have such a passion for that still. And I think that's been, a hard lesson and a habit for me to break over time where perhaps if something is written in a different way than I would have written it, that doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong or bad. So having to take a step back and think about whether I would rewrite it because it needs it or just because it's not how I would do it. I think that's like a pretty intentional step for somebody who's very practitioner forward in their role. But I think that comes with time as you're deliberate and you focus on that bigger picture, around you, integrating into other business functions, understanding what makes your company tick. That's also really important, I think, to any role, but especially an intel or security leader. If ad revenue is what makes your company successful, you should really learn that as well to some degree, figure out how to create intelligence that makes sense for that and advocate for your team in different ways around that. I think that really helps zoom out a bit more, but keeps the grounding in the real work.
When it comes to bringing new practitioners up to speed, you've sat in their chair, you've been an analyst, you've gotten really good at that role, you've escalated in your career. How do you train one of those new people to get good at the role? Because it's very stressful and they're not used to the volume, perhaps, of all the information that's coming in. What are some of the top tips that you give to people that are leading teams to up-level their team over time?
This is a really pertinent topic. There's been quite a few really interesting studies about the profile of a security or intelligence, someone who's in this business and how it's changing over time. A lot of people in the security and intelligence business have been dominated by backgrounds from law enforcement, from military. I'm come from, military intelligence background myself. So I totally see that. And that was an unexpected thing for me, pivoting out of civilian military intelligence to the private sector and seeing that there were a lot of the same people there that, I was working with at the Pentagon was a interesting dynamic to see, but we're seeing less of that now with younger people that are going directly into corporate security jobs and they're not going into government or military spaces initially. And that, I think, in a very positive way, it changes, the culture and the fabric of a lot of these organizations. But that also means where are they getting their training and where are they learning and how are they continuing to learn these things as they move along in their career. And there's a lot of good organizations that are doing training and, you can tap into those resources too. But I actually think some of those people that do come from those, longer backgrounds, I think it's really on us to provide that training. Like that's something that I do with my own team and my director on my team as well. He comes from a similar background. And so it's really on us to make sure, we're imparting those bits of wisdom or lessons learned on the younger folks on our team as well. We take that mentorship and sort of training responsibility quite personally to pass that along to them in, a pretty significant way.
Do you think this pipeline of new talent coming from different sources than perhaps where they did in the past, or just this focus on protective intelligence in general, are they becoming the new standard overall? Do people have to shift their mindset, or is this just a temporary focus? What do you think?
Part of me thinks that it's not a fad because I think EP and PI have been this longstanding discipline. It has been more in focus now and it might go, a little bit less out of focus with some time. But I think the overall PI discipline is really here to stay because it's the threat environment that we're reacting to that makes PI such a successful discipline. The things that you do within a protective intelligence organization are applicable to things beyond executive protection. That's investigations. That's for an operations center. It's applicable to lots of different places, and it's really what the threat environment around us is necessitating now. So I think that the principles that a protective intelligence team operates within will endure because that's the direction that the threats are taking us. So as I said earlier, there are teams that are growing in remit because of the way that they operate. They can do lots of other different things. And sort of that profile of that person that's successful on a protective intelligence team is someone that can do many different things. So that person is inherently going to be successful. And a lot of these companies do more with less. Somebody who can actually quite literally do more with less is inherently going to just be more successful in a lot of these environments.
When you speak with organizations that are just really new to protective intelligence, what are some signs that their programs are still operating reactively?
There's quite a lot on that spectrum. At baseline, you do see ones that are just kind of trying to check the box. They're working, within their own personnel constraints, potentially time constraints. There's a lot that post UHG have been asked to also do protective intelligence on top of doing investigations and watch floor operations and then any other hat that they wear. So there's a lot of organizations like that. And they're primarily, you see them usually doing two main things, and that's travel risk management to some degree and online threat detection, usually with kind of some level of investigation with that. And those two things usually form the basis of a basic protective intelligence program, sort of starting from scratch, or within like an operations center that maybe isn't built for that necessarily. But I might actually flip the question as well, because I think it's some of the more enlightening things I have found are where teams are doing it really well And that isn't necessarily dependent on whether they're mature in their development or not. And it's really interesting because I think intel and security business hasn't always been as relationship building driven necessarily in the past. It's, of course, like a key thing for everybody, but for protective intelligence work, I think that's so essential. And that's a key differentiator that you see across teams that are really doing it well to a high standard, no matter how many people they have or how much money or resources they have, because having those key relationships with stakeholders is what is giving them trust and ultimately access to information to actually get proactive and go beyond the reactive. So, if you have a relationship with an executive assistant who then sends you a threat that came into the executive's inbox, you've now just been given access to something that you otherwise wouldn't have had. And I have heard stories from teams that have headed off threats and engaged with law enforcement exactly by way of something like that. So the ability to create those relationships and devote time to those key stakeholders shouldn't be understated. And again, that can be done with small resources or a less mature team. And that includes other parts of the business too. I would be remiss if I didn't point out relationships with HR, with legal, with policy teams. They're all part of that equation. So you can really be, doing all the right things from a protective intelligence perspective. But if you don't have the strong stakeholder relationships, you will be hampered, in how far you can go with it.
Yeah, without a doubt, those relationships are really huge. One thing you said before was this concept of sometimes things become a fad. It's like, hey, we need to do this. We need to invest more in protective intelligence, get more anticipatory, proactive instead of reactive. The executives tell you you need to do this, but then they don't give you the resources to do it. So how would you coach a leader out there that has been told, I want you to do this activity, but we're not going to give you the resources for it? Do you push back and say, look, we literally just can't do it. I don't think we're doing it. I'm not just going to check a box pretending we're doing it, and instead push back and ask for those funds? Like, what do you coach someone to do in that case?
I am a big believer in being really honest about trade-offs, but in a situation like that. So I think it's a two-part. It's a conversation of, if you wanted to do this the right way, if you wanted to develop a protective intelligence program, we would need X amount of resources. We would need these tools to do this and this much time to set it up. And if the answer is no to that, well, here's what I can give you within the constraints of what I'm operating with. And if the answer back is, well, you have to do that other thing, then you're clearly at an impasse there. But I think really laying out the trade-offs in this business is so super important, because it means life safety in some cases. And if you're overpromising on what you're able to deliver in that space, especially in a protective intelligence world where somebody's sending a message to somebody's inbox, potentially it manifests into a physical real world threat, you don't want to overstate what you're capable of doing. So I think it's really laying out plainly and cleanly what the trade-offs are. And if the answer is you still have to do it, then it's where you start to get in the game of trade-offs of, well, then I won't be able to do this other pieces over here in order to accomplish this mission. I know that's probably not always the easiest conversation to have, but I think in a business where you're actually dealing, again, with life safety, it's really important to be really clear.
Yeah, I think so too. And that's just part of the role of being a leader, is you have to step in and give the hard truth. And sometimes it's uncomfortable, but if you're not doing that, then you're not doing your job. So social media plays a really significant role in executive protection today. How do you see teams struggling with this huge volume and pressure that comes with monitoring it?
Yes, it's a significant issue. Trying to deal with the noise of social media is one of the single greatest challenges, with any corporate intelligence team at this point, because, as you said, the volume is so high. I do think that oftentimes teams get caught up or distracted in social media because they're continually looking to find the needle in the haystack, find the singular threat, the thing that makes everybody fearful, you'll miss and manifest into that real world threat. So you do need to find, or at least look to, and try to find the needle in the haystack. So that is important. But by way of that, I think often teams wind up missing the bigger picture and seeing where trends are manifesting. And, in a real world setting, in this environment now, threats now manifest across spaces. So you have teams that maybe the team at the NFL wasn't necessarily thinking about health grievances as potentially affecting them, but the same grievance pattern that affected UHG wound up potentially impacting the NFL offices and by way of that Blackstone offices in the same building in New York City. And so if you're not following the bigger picture, you potentially miss the things that are happening in the space of trends. And so by way of hunting for that needle, you potentially risk losing sight of the bigger picture. And I completely resonate with teams that do need to find that needle, because if you do miss it, that means budgets, that means reputation and credibility. And so it's important to look for that and try to find that where it exists. But you shouldn't lose sight of the bigger picture, that's at play in the threat environment space.
What's a good way to do that as a team?
You can lean on tools to do it. There's a lot of tools that will help you, but that's a resource constraint as well to that. So if you don't have the resources to get the right large suite of tools that are going to do that for you in the right way, then it is continuing to find that needle. But yes, pulling back and making sure you're looking at the wider trends in the space. And some of the teams that I see that do it really well are pretty intentional about, like maybe they issue a weekly or a monthly report about trends in the protective intelligence space. There's a law enforcement agency out of New Jersey, actually, that puts out an amazing newsletter, and they just address all of the different threats in the protective intelligence space that are publicly known that you can find on the news. And that's a really good way of sort of looking at the bigger picture that's out there, maybe in a more intentional way that also informs your leadership, but also is a point for you to sort of take a step back and sort of look at what's happening bigger picture.
Yeah, it's almost like a heat map.
Exactly. And there's a lot of companies that will put the information out online for free to reach out to sort of understand those trends in the space as well.
Well, as more conversations shift to private or encrypted spaces, how does this change the way organizations approach online threat detection?
It changes many things. I think everybody now is really trying to figure out how they get access to the private channels and closed channels across lots of different social media platforms. That's really become the name of the game now. Less dark web, deep and dark web is a kind of different space, and you still need to do that for certain reasons. But then it progressed to the open social media channels, X and the like, and you still need to do that. And now we just laid on top of that all of the closed channels and things that are happening there. And as you try to find that needle, you do risk getting so bogged down in something like X, where actually the real conversations or things that you want to know are actually happening in those closed channels. And that's a real challenge to know, how do I know what I need to be in, or, where I need to look to find that. And getting access to that presents its own challenges, sock puppet accounts and things like that. And that creates legal constraints and concerns. And it's a very complex environment now to try and get into those spaces or understand what's happening in those spaces. Now, can you even be certain that something in there is happening that you need to know about? And you've taken all of these time and resources to get access to not see what you thought you would have seen there. So it's a really difficult challenge to conquer now, to try and get into those right kinds of channels. Of course, anybody can set up another channel if they feel like it was compromised, and then you're sort of playing whack-a-mole with that as well.
Yeah, and then on top of that, you've got all this AI-generated content that's really throwing you off track of where the real threats are. So it's just a compounding problem.
The concern of like what AI is able to do within that that's a whole other can of worms. Within, you integrate that on top of the access challenges, and now how do you know what's right, what's real, where you need to find the real things? It really complicates the threat landscape.
Yeah, it certainly does. Well, how has the way that you think about grievances and the motivation behind social media threats evolved over the past months or years with all these changes?
I think now more than ever, everyone has some kind of grievance. Every organization will have some type of user grievance that they have to figure out how to address. And again, evidence no more than what happened with the NFL, a grievance that potentially they weren't necessarily even tracking. A health-related grievance can affect companies in different ways that potentially they weren't anticipating. And so how do you anticipate what those grievances are? I do think it probably comes down to that relationship building, understanding where your company's policies are shifting, how they're being viewed, understanding back into your business, how they're thinking about policies, any potentially controversial announcements. And that really spans not just the Metas and the Googles of the world, but really it could be any company in this environment that issues a policy or says something or makes a decision that winds up being publicly controversial. and someone has a grievance about. And so that is really a significant challenge that everybody should be taking very seriously because it spans beyond just those large companies now. And there is a part of this grievance landscape, if you bring it back to sort of like protective intelligence tactics, I think it's a classic example of how this is applicable, beyond just a PI scope. You may not be that concerned by a public policy that was posted from the organization you're supporting, and nobody said anything publicly, you haven't found anything, but that potential, user who has a grievance may have sent a direct message or an email to your executive. LinkedIn is a very popular place for that to happen as well. It could happen really across any kind of platform. And by having that relationship with those key stakeholders, they'll again, in turn, send that to you. You have access to that. And then that prompts a deeper review of their online activity. Maybe that reveals a problematic pattern that you didn't know about before in that space. And so really trying to get into the nitty-gritty of those user grievances and those patterns in that space is going to be really important for you to get from reactive to proactive in a more impactful way.
So as protective intelligence and executive protection spaces continue to evolve, what mindset shift do you think security leaders need to make to stay ahead of things?
I think they need to be thinking about the big picture. What goes back to the user grievances from you, because when you look at the threat environment as it stands now and the landscape that we're operating within, we can only control that so much. I think really focusing on that bigger picture is where you're going to get the most bang for your buck in identifying the right spaces and the right risks and threats that your organization is facing. I think that's probably the most significant thing. Moving away from hunting for the needle, knowing we still need to do that, but then being more proactive about the wider trends in the space. And how do we know that something is impacting one organization and it won't impact my organization? I think that's the single greatest change that you can make, being less hyper-focused on the singular event. UHG, a significant, hugely significant event in the space, and for every industry, virtually every region, being less focused on that as a singular event and more focused on bigger picture, what that means and why that happened in a bigger way, I think is the single greatest mindset shift that we need to think about now.
Yeah, so just kind of watch the forest overall and see how the health of it is shifting and moving and morphing, and don't just focus on those individual trees.
This is a very military kind of term, but they call it a soda straw view. So if you're looking through a straw, you'll only see what's at the end of the straw. Is a very small view, but actually if you pull the straw away, there's a much bigger picture there to look at.
What a great note to end on. Melissa, thank you for being on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I had a great time.
To learn more about Melissa and her work with Cirrus, click the links in the episode description. You can also watch the video highlights on Alert Media's YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the show wherever you get your podcasts. Stay safe out there.
Thank you for listening to the Employee Safety Podcast from Alert Media, the industry's most intuitive emergency communication and threat intelligence solution. To learn more about how to protect your people and business during critical events, visit alertmedia.com. Until next time.